Good evening, friends, and welcome to Tim Kirby Russia, a show with a very appropriate name because it's got the Tim Kirby part, being me. I've worked as a political analyst and radio talk show host in Russia for many, many years, and it's got the Russia part. And Russia is sort of the home of a lot of new and different, well, not always new, ideas that unfortunately seem to remain trapped within Russia, trapped, written in Russian, on the Russian side of the internet, never to be released. And I think that's a bit of a crime. So when I got the opportunity to put together this sort of more philosophical series that really takes a deep dive into this sort of Russian way of thinking, well, of course I jumped at the chance because it's something I've wanted to do for a long time. And our first topic, starting today, will be censorship. And later in the episode, we're going to have as our guest to discuss censorship, former police officer, American dissident, and hardcore anti-censorship advocate, John Mark Dougan.
They were going to do that to me, then I wasn't going to respect their privacy. And so I exploited the public record system, and I dumped 14,000 names, phone numbers, and addresses of confidential records, FBI agents, CIA, Department of Homeland Security, federal judges, all of these people. I just dumped their information online.
He's going to be with us, and he's going to tell us how he sees things and how censorship actually works in our 21st century. So stay tuned for that. But for now, let's take a brief overview of the way Russians look at censorship. And based on Soviet stereotypes, it's not going to be what you're expecting. Okay, so first off, if we were to go around America, right, and just talk to people, how do they feel about censorship? In general, everyone is going to say that censorship is bad, right? And more often than not, people are going to say that we don't really have censorship in America, okay? That we're one of the censorship-free countries, but there are places like North Korea or China where they do, which is interesting. Now, when you talk to Russians, it's not so much is censorship bad or the difference between the countries, it's more a question of what needs to be censored. And that's a big difference. And I think that's a little bit of a problem in the United States because if we look at things, there's always been censorship in the American media and in our personal lives. There's always been, at some point in time, things that you just can't say. If you go back to sort of the proto-America of medieval England, back then, basically saying things against religion was a really bad idea for your health. But on the other hand, a lot of the stories, the fairy tales told to children, were much more grim and brutal than anything you could ever get away with showing on TV now. Moving forward, if we go to the Victorian era, people back then were definitely anti-sex, especially compared to those in the medieval times or those now. Sex was the ultimate devil. However, certain things like eugenics were openly discussed and not exactly frowned upon. Well, if we go to the 1950s, sex was still overall bad. You still had Lucy and Desi sleeping in separate beds, but that was very quickly changing. And skirts were definitely getting shorter. But you could not show Elvis dancing on TV. His hip movements were considered far too lust-inducing to be shown in public. But at that time, saying some of the things that we would say today that are natural, that all people are equal and all the races should get along, that stuff was definitely a no-go during the segregation period. And now, on modern-day TV, you are definitely going to see a lot more than just Elvis's hip shaking. But on the other side, a lot of the opinions that people had in the medieval period about religion, the Victorian era's view of race, and the sort of do everything for your country attitude of the 1950s, that is off the airwaves very often officially. So the thing is that when we look through history, there's always been censorship. You still really can't say the F word on TV, and do you really want people to constantly say that? Do you want people to be naked on your primetime viewing of YouTube? I don't think you do. And that's the real difference between Russia and America. So in America, we have this idea that we live without censorship, censorship is bad, and yet pretty much all of us demand it because we want it, because we don't want to be surrounded by repulsive or disgusting or shocking or violent images all the time. Whereas in Russia, people seem to get that. They know that censorship can go too far because it went too far in the Soviet Union. It went so far that in certain periods, what they called the stagnation period of Brezhnev, I mean, when you turned on a TV in 1970, and if you were to turn it on in 1979, it was literally exactly the same thing. So I think when Russians went through that period of absolute and total censorship, they definitely saw that it didn't work. It's nuts, it's absurd, and a lot of the criticisms that America made or makes of countries like North Korea are actually kind of fair. But what happened in the 90s, especially the early 90s, was you went from a society of total control to a society of zero control. Whoever had money could show whatever they want to whoever they want, and it was extremely destructive for Russian society. The 1990s killed more Russians than World War II did, according to some statistics. So you have to also understand that Russians have had these two very extreme experiences, and that's where today people sort of understand that, you know what, you don't want to show an old naked man masturbating on TV. That's not cool. But in Sweden, the Supreme Court actually there supported a few years ago the right of an elderly man to publicly masturbate because it doesn't hurt anyone technically. Yes, it does. It does hurt society. And that's the kind of thing you need to censor, and something that Russians definitely would censor. Now, one other thing that's important to understand about censorship in a sort of different civilization, in a different universe that's on our planet, is that the idea of freedom is a little bit different here. And when you think about it, a lot of our freedom actually depends on whether we agree with other people in society or not. Okay, so hear me out. All right. Say, we all have this sort of view in America that there's this one idea of freedom, that if you adopt this sort of Western-style democracy and do X, Y, and Z, then somehow you're free. And all the people who don't do that are not free. But the thing is, let's say some man who's a very hardcore Muslim, and he's in Saudi Arabia, and he really, really believes in the values of let's say Wahhabism. Let's go to the extreme, right? And he believes in all that. Wouldn't he feel very free and very comfortable living in a society that more or less kind of agrees with that sort of way of looking at the world, right? Well, he would. Maybe he's not technically free. Maybe if he were to commit adultery, he could be in a lot of trouble. In fact, his head could be in a lot of trouble from being detached from his body. But overall, he would feel very free. The same thing is that maybe some people actually would like to live in some sort of weird Paris commune, kibbutz, isolated communal society, which for me sounds pretty repulsive. But for them, that could be very freeing from having to go to some awful office job. But anyways, you're seeing my point, is that in a lot of times we mistake freedom for being this unique, specific set of things that gives us freedom, with the fact that when we tend to agree with everyone in society, then we are free to do whatever we want. If you agree with the generic stance of Russia, and you live your life here, you're always going to feel very free because no one is going to stop you from saying things that they agree with, or at least don't find particularly shocking or awful. And that's one thing that's important about censorship. Because one thing that's happening right now in America is Americas have become very divided into two distinct Americas. The Trump America and the sort of liberal, progressive America. Or we could say the Tea Party populist America. And one of the reasons why I think Americans are feeling more push from censorship is because this half, they really, really do not like what this half has to say. It seems threatening, violent, scary, and hateful. Whereas I think this half sees this liberal progressive stuff as being very damaging, suicidal, and definitely going against the traditional way of doing things in the world. But what if that wasn't the case? What if tomorrow everyone in America woke up, as pretty much everyone, 90% of the population, woke up as being some sort of woke liberal? Well, then all the censorship for big tech against Donald Trump himself, Alex Jones, and all those guys, no one would notice. No one would care. The overwhelming majority agrees with it, and they'd feel perfectly free to write all their woke messages and talk about the white privilege and all that other stuff to their heart's content. So you see, the thing about censorship is it's very important for society to have cohesion, Because if there's a certain agreement level, a certain cohesion level, then censorship kind of fades away. And all the censorship that does exist, you pretty much agree with, and it doesn't bother you. So before I talked a little bit about how what is being censored changed from the medieval times to Victorian to the 1950s to the present, and a bit about how when something is very different, if it's a very different worldview from your own, that's more likely to be censored because you find it to be scary or offensive, or there's for some reason you feel that needs to be sort of squashed. Now, one thing, again, about Russia that's very different is certain kind of soft power political terms are completely mainstream. They're like the same type of terminology that everyone knows, like the expression out of left field. Despite that being a baseball expression, I think pretty much even every person in England has heard that. So the idea of the Overton window is actually very popular in Russia. And if we were to walk around city streets asking people if they've heard that expression, it would probably be 70, 80, maybe even more percent of the population has at least heard of this concept of the Overton window. And that's what's really, I think, happening, especially in America. Because what happens with the Overton window is you sort of have this area. You have an entire gigantic sort of two-dimensional, perhaps three-dimensional, it could be an Overton cube window, but a two-dimensional plane. And some of it is covered by this window, by this square. And what's inside the square is basically all the ideas that are acceptable. What's on the edge of the square are ideas that are kind of edgy. And outside the square are basically ideas that are sort of blasphemous. And you can see that as history moves, as we moved from sort of, if we're going to look at things in terms of some sort of, let's say, racial things, which are very relevant right now in America. Well, in the 1950s, the Overton window was in one position where any sort of racial interaction was absolutely unacceptable. The edgy position was to sort of maybe go for that, and a blasphemous position would be some sort of basically the ideas that people believe in today. But slowly over time, the window moved, and over time, the ideas of the 1950s attitudes towards race moved out and out towards the edge of the window, and now they're outside the window, and the window has brought in more modern, progressive ideas towards racial interaction in America inside the window. The fact is that the window is always moving, and it affects our attitudes towards sex, politics, race, economics. The window is always moving a little bit. Someone's always pushing it, and our ideas are always changing. And if you look throughout history, you can definitely see that all ideas fall into those sort of three categories. Inside the window, acceptable, on the edge of it being edgy, logically, and something being far outside the window as being blasphemous. And one of the reasons I think why Russians understand that is because their Overton window within Russian society in 1917 and 1991 completely jumped to another completely different part of the map within a couple days. All right, these were radical changes. And when that happens, you can really, really see it. Whereas the slow sort of changes in attitudes towards sex, race, and other things in America have been a much more gradual process. So gradual, you don't even really notice it. It's kind of like when you see your children grow up every day. You don't really see them getting bigger. But if someone hasn't seen your son or daughter in like 5 years, they'll be like, wow, she's gotten so big. That's it. So if in America there is going to be some sort of really radical ideological shift, that's probably the day that people open up to the idea. So pretty much the fact that the Overton window is a real thing, and it's a key factor in what we choose to censor and not censor. All right, so I hope you found that interesting. Now let's jump to our guest, American dissident, former police officer, and hardcore anti-censorship activist, John Mark Dougan. In fact, the Russian government tried and failed to block Telegram. So isn't John a bit of a hypocrite for fleeing to Russia?
Well, so, I mean, I'm wanted by Interpol. I don't know if you know.
No, we didn't get into that yet, yes.
Yeah, so...
For?
19 recordings of dirty police officers admitting to engaging in crime.
Well, why is that a crime to release or expose?
Because in my state, in the state of Florida, you're not allowed to record somebody else without their consent. Even if they're admitting...
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, there was just a big case recently where this, I think she was 10 or 12-year-old girl. She was being raped by her stepfather, and she recorded it. And they would not allow the recording of this crime in court because it's illegal. Now, this is a law written by politicians and people who have an interest in not being recorded. So, so I could actually face 95 years in prison.
Well, that answered my question. But maybe John was just born at the right time. You know, people always say we're losing our rights, which implies that at some point we had them. So was there some sort of censorship-free golden age that I just don't remember?
No. You know, and I kind of understand why on these federally regulated television channels, why you can't say like really awful stuff or show really awful stuff. I mean, you got kids watching, and you know there has to be, I guess, kind of a balance when you're broadcasting. But that doesn't mean that the people can't just say it themselves. And I think probably the 80s might have been the golden age of freedom in terms of like the early 80s, in terms of what you could do. But, you know, they've been piling on the laws. People in America don't believe me when I say, you know what, you should Google the Russian criminal code. There's 165 pages of laws that you have to follow in Russia. There's 30,000 pages of law, of criminal code in the United States that you have to follow. 30,000. Everything you can think of almost in America.
And that's exactly the problem. Wasn't it liberty that made America amazing? Well, when everything is being made illegal, that makes liberty vanish.
You know, they say the average person in America commits 3 felonies every single day. Okay?
Which ones?
Just Google the book. There's a book.
There's a whole book. I see. Okay.
For instance, calling in sick to work. Did you know you could actually have 5 years in prison for that?
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's called honest services fraud. And if you call in sick to work and you go, for instance, to a nightclub or a baseball game, you've committed honest services fraud. And if they don't like you, they can put you in prison for it. And it happened with a guy. There's an actual case about this. It wasn't calling sick to work. He used his work computer to check like the scores on his fantasy football league. And he was in bad with the government. And I don't remember why they started investigating him. But they tried to put him in jail for 5 years for that. For exceeding unauthorized access. That is a law. That's a federal law.
So why is it that nowadays 1776 is banned in America, but A-OK in Russia?
Well, you know, that's a good question. And I had a very interesting conversation with a politician here once who actually used to work for Boris Yeltsin. And he's,
oh, boy.
And he said something really profound. This was like 6 years ago. And it's so true today. But he said, you know, I see Russia is going to where America was in the 80s and America going to where Russia was in the 80s. And I was like, well, maybe we'll see. And darn if he didn't predict that correctly. But, you know, after the Soviet Union collapsed, I think people were so kind of fed up with censorship and stuff and their rights being violated, they won't tolerate it anymore. So I think you have a lot of liberties here in Russia.
And also, I think it's been sort of proven that this sort of total censorship, it really didn't work because the Brezhnev period was known as the stagnant period, you know, of complete stagnation. That's really what defines the entire period. And because of the censorship, there was no way to really change things. Everything was just sort of stuck in the same sort of early 1960s rhetoric. And it just made people annoyed and frustrated and boxed in. So I think in Russia there is censorship, but it's a lot more light. And I think it allows people to sort of blow off steam, maybe push society here or there. I will put it this way. There's a lot more ideological change and development over the last 15 years that I've been here than there were during the Brezhnev period.
I bet.
I mean, you could turn on the TV in, I think, 1970 and turn it on in 1979 and not one thing changed.
Yeah. But, you know, I have something. It's an interesting point. But I will tell you this. So you have the Americans saying, you can't protest in Russia, you get arrested, blah, blah, blah. It's not true. I was in Khabarovsk.
Yeah.
In
Khabarovsk. But anyway.
Thank you. I was there.
It's okay.
That's a very hard word for me to pronounce.
It takes time.
I was there in July. And do you remember what was happening there in July?
Oh, well, yeah, because they arrested the governor or mayor.
The mayor.
Mayor, excuse me. And and there was a sort of public outcry that may have actually been not as big of a part of the public as they made it seem.
Yeah. So, anyways, I was there during these protests.
Okay.
And I took my camera.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to check it out.
Yeah.
And I went and I kind of walked with these protesters, talked to some of them, saw what was happening with the police, and I was shocked. And I'm going to tell you why.
Okay.
The police were there passing out masks and bottles of water.
Oh, interesting.
People were complaining. People were like, "Oh, Putin this, Putin that, and this new mayor, whatever." You know what disgruntled people say.
Yeah. Everything's bad. Well, especially Russians. When something's bad, everything's bad. Yeah.
So it was very interesting for me to actually watch this happening, and and I've seen the protests here too. Yeah. And it seems like, they do arrest people, but the only time they're getting arrested is when they're protesting in places where they don't have the permits, when they're trying to block businesses, trying to block roads.
But one thing is then, isn't it sort of against the idea if you have this freedom of speech, the freedom to express yourself and the freedom of association as in to congregate together, how can the government tell you that you can only protest inside of this box? Because that policy is in Europe and America too, right? Are you really free if you can only protest in this area on this day from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m.?
Well, that's a good point. But the problem with protests, especially in America, is the reason they have these rules is because you're infringing on other people's liberties. Look at how many people. I remember seeing this. It was really a shocking video. There was a black guy, and he was at the front of a line. These Black Lives Matter protesters blocking the road. He's like, "Please, I've got to go to work. I'm going to get fired. I got babies at home. I got to feed." Yeah. And they would not let him pass. I mean, where is his right to go to work and provide for his family? Yeah. So everything is a compromise. Okay. You have freedom of speech, but you don't have the freedom to impede on somebody else's freedom to go about their business, go about their day, go about their lives.
Yeah. Now, those protests, were they really massive? Did you really feel like this was a public outrage, or did it feel more like a liberal clique decided to take a picnic?
It didn't seem like it was that big. I mean, there were probably 100 people there when I was there. So I guess it wasn't like super small, but it wasn't anything significant like what the media. Like I was watching the Western media, it wasn't anything what they were making it out to be.
So does John have any other examples of censorship that we should be aware of?
So it's a very multi-tiered way that they can clamp down on you. So they can clamp down on the highest level, which is like social media sites. So, for instance, what they did with Donald Trump. Then you have like the mid-tier. They could deplatform you, right? And when they deplatform you, they remove your services. And actually, there's a radio talk show host in America who was deplatformed. She called me up and she said, my website has just disappeared. GoDaddy wrote that they just got rid of my website.
That's it.
Yeah. So now her website is being hosted here in the Russian Federation.
Oh, of course. Because Time Web doesn't care.
Yeah. So, but then you have the lowest, like the most devious level is they can steal your domain name, which that happened to
Interesting.
me. Yep. So I used to have pbsotalk.com.
So even if you have a domain name that you paid, it's registered to you for the X amount of time, they can just take it.
Absolutely.
And that's not some sort of involved with like a warrant or a criminal case, just whatever.
They can take it. They can say, you know what, you've violated our terms and services.
Wow.
They take your domain name. They can, and while we're talking about terms and services, so, Parler, they were stupid. They were hosted on Amazon. They should have known better.
Yeah.
Gab was a little smarter. They started buying their own servers, from what I hear, although it's an awful service. But the one problem that they're going to face now that I see, it hasn't happened yet, but I see this coming, is their internet service provider. So they have to host through somebody. Somebody has to give bandwidth to their servers.
Yeah.
So maybe it's Comcast, maybe it's AT&T. And these woke companies now,
they're just going to say, no,
they're going to say, you know what, your content that's being distributed through us is a violation of our terms and service.
If you enjoyed our first episode, please like and share this video. It really helps because all the algorithms are against us.